Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this, our second in our series of weekly trade and tariff briefings and discussions. I'm Troy Keller, Dorsey and Whitney. I'm lucky enough to be the International Trade and Commercial Policy Advisor of World Trade Center Utah and the co-chair of Salt Lake Chamber's Public Policy Committee. And today, as you're aware, we're doing the second in this series. We've launched this series to keep companies better informed and equipped on tariff-related issues. Our goal is to provide the most updated information, necessary tools, and really bring Utah businesses together regularly to share what they're seeing and make sure we all have the benefit of best practices or best thoughts and making sure we're all updated. One recommendation I would say is as we do this as a business community, you should also be doing the same thing in each of your businesses. I think best practices result from the people talk together and share from their roles and their perspective what they're seeing. If we're trying to do that again here today with Utah's business focused trade associations and businesses. Our presenter today is Ben Collender, Chief of Staff for World Trade Center Utah, and really has been more in the weeds on this than I think almost anyone in the state. And we're lucky to have him today. He'll provide an update on recent trade developments and key implications for businesses utilizing the World Trade Center Utah's new tariff dashboard. Following his presentation, we'll then open the floor for some discussion. So please, and in the meanwhile, feel free to submit questions using the Q&A functions in the chat. Just as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Chamber's website afterwards. With that, let's go ahead and get started. So Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Troy. I'm going to share my screen because I'm going to update everyone off of the tariff dashboard. First of all, I also want to say in between briefings, if businesses or people have questions about tariffs, we'd like to welcome those as well, just of course in the chat or as part of this session, but it helps us put together an agenda and make sure that we're clear in what we're communicating and are getting the best information out to businesses. So with that, there have been a lot of updates since we last spoke last week. I'm just going to walk through these one by one, and then we will, take questions at the end. So the first and most important is the 125% tariff that was announced on China. So you can see that here at the top. There are a few things to raise about this. We received a lot of questions about, is this 125% on top of everything else that's been announced? And it's a little, we realized we needed to clarify that on our dashboard for everybody. So we did a breakdown because it does not include the original 20% for fentanyl, but it does include the other tariffs that have been added with IEEPA since the original baseline 20% for fentanyl. So we've seen this morning, and so that adds up, as you can see on the dashboard, to actually 125% in new tariffs since the beginning of this administration. And we've seen this morning China retaliate so that now their tariff amount is at 125% plus 20% as well. So what we anticipate happening as a result is likely that these tariffs, if the administration matches them, we may see that number go up to 126%. And I was just talking with Troy right before this, and it sounds like China has said as well that they don't plan to retaliate further because it's effectively stopped imports into China from the United States already. So there's no sense in continuing. So just a little bit of context on what we're seeing and what we're hearing. But there are some notable exemptions to be tracking in the goods targeted section below, like in the column on the tariffs as well. Another piece of information in sort of breaking this down is that these tariffs are, let's just say they're coming in fast, and sometimes it's unclear. And the reason that we do this dashboard is because we want to bring clarity and simplicity behind it. So I know we've got a lot on this line item, but an example is that, there was some debate as to whether the 20% was included or not. And so we're reading through those executive orders, and some may have heard that there was some even debate in the White House on what the president meant with his text that went out and what was implemented. And so we're tracking those things and updating them on our dashboard real time to help keep the most up-to-date information available for our business community. So the second item, scrolling down, is the 90-day pause. So right now, we haven't seen a specific date. It may exist, and we just haven't seen it yet, but we just estimated 90 days from April 9th. So as many of you are aware, these are the tariffs that were announced on April 2nd with the big charts and all the variable numbers for each individual country. Those were paused, but not the baseline 10%. So you can see that we've broken that down. You can see a couple of items below. You will see the baseline 10% as a separate line item. So this is sort of the higher variable rate, which was pulled back, and the Trump administration had cited that many countries were coming to the table to negotiate, and that's what he wanted to see. And so, though there was a 90-day pause instituted on all the variable tariffs outside of China's variable tariff, and China saw additional tariffs instituted. So you can see on this there, we're tracking July 8th right now, and I think we'll be getting waves of new information on this item in particular as those negotiations play out between now and July. One item that we discussed in the last webinar, and I'm going to move down to the next one. One item that we discussed in the last webinar briefly was the de minimis loophole. It was mentioned briefly in the press conference on April 2nd. A lot of the attention had been put around sort of the global variable tariff that we had just discussed, but there was also an important executive order signed around de minimis goods. We're still tracking that implementation date for those as May 2nd. And as you can see on the tariff dashboard on the far right side, you can sort of see the flow of information that comes down in terms of technical documents. There's an announcement, which normally is followed by an executive or a White House fact sheet in this instance, but sometimes that doesn't come out. Then an executive order, and then the Federal Register, which formalizes the executive order and sometimes has supplementary information in it. And then the CSMS is the Customs Service Messaging System, which is essentially the guidance to customs in all of their field offices for how to actually implement the tariff. So that's where the rubber meets the road, and a lot of the technical, real detailed technical questions are addressed about the tariff. So we're still pending that guidance on de minimis and how that's going to be enforced. But as soon as that is provided, we'll link that to the website as well. And the last thing is the additional 10% on all global tariffs. And I had heard this morning, there was this reaction in the markets after the 90-day pause where the markets essentially had euphoria. And then when the analysts went back and looked at all the calculations with the 10% pause, you're seeing some of the retraction in the markets right now because still significant tax on goods coming into the United States that will impact the economy. Of course, not as severe as the wider tariffs that were in place that have the 90-day pause. But that combined with escalations on Chinese and American tariffs on Chinese goods are really giving some headwinds, let's say, to the market. So this tariff went into effect on April 5th. So it's enacted now. As you can see on the bottom link, there's a CSMS, and guidance has been given to customs. So if you have goods coming in, there are exemptions to this. So goods loaded into a vessel at the port of loading and in transit for their final mode of transportation before the reciprocal tariffs took effect. That's one nuance to pay attention to and maybe talk to your brokers about as you're seeing your goods come in, is making sure that they're paying attention to that exemption. And obviously there's, on this one, they're not planning on double tariffing if it's a steel and aluminum product. And there are exclusions on this, and we've hyperlinked a full list of exclusions for the considerations. There's a third point. So Annex 2, if you just click that link, you could see the full list, and you can scroll through there, because it may be the case that you have an item that you're concerned about, and it's just in that Annex 2, and you're essentially in a safe space. So with that, those are the major updates that we saw this week. Troy, if I'm not missing anything, I'm going to stop sharing, and happy to take any questions, unless I'm missing something you want to raise.
No. I think you've captured. I mean, as we joked last week, every day brings new development, and this week has been the same. It's just continued, even with April 2nd kind of being the big day. It's continued on almost daily with one update or another. So thanks, Ben. And that I can't say it again. I've heard just recently multiple times how that dashboard is just so beneficial for companies. There are lots of executive order dashboards out there, but very few that are just as narrowly focused just on the tariffs, and this and what you guys have done is so great and it's put together so well. There are a couple of clarifying questions. One ask is, could you just repeat what the 125% in China, if that is all there is, or if it's stacked up, and just kind of go over that one more time.
I believe, if I'm reading this correctly, I'm not as attuned to the retaliatory, so take this with that in mind. But I believe it's a 145% total. So they have a similar sort of 20% on the US plus 125. So China's essentially seeing this as 145% total to match the US's 145%. But what we're seeing here is there's a disagreement of about 41%. So every time China does this, we raise our tariffs to match, and then China goes back and raises again, which is the 186% that we're estimating if the US retaliates. So that's how I believe this is being calculated on the Chinese side, and I saw some language around that this morning. But one thing we plan to do is start to track the retaliations a little bit better as we approach some of the negotiations on the global tariffs, and of course the China retaliation. And if we can get that down on our dashboard in a clean way to communicate, we intend to do that as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. Another question, could we clarify what's currently in effect with respect to Canada and Mexico? Question here says they understand that those countries are impacted by IEEPA, but maybe paused, but they had others in effect at the HTS level. Could you, do you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, I'm going to share my screen again really quick and just use the dashboard to walk us through these questions. So with respect to Canada, people will likely remember that in terms of the global tariff that was enacted in the additional 10%, Canada and Mexico were excluded, because we're looking at them and talking about them completely separately than the rest of the world, primarily because of the USMCA update. So with Canada, a little bit of good news, a little bit of bad news. Mostly good news, though. I mean, the bad news is tariffs in general on goods being imported from Canada. I mean, to be realistic. But when we look through the USMCA portion, which we'll go to right here, the major thing to look at is this section right here. Is that highlighting for everyone when I highlight on my screen? Great. So Canada and Mexico are a little bit tricky. USMCA goods still fit under the USMCA agreement. That's a little nuance that's maybe been lost in the press, and a lot of the dialogue is a lot of the USMCA goods are not impacted at all by tariffs at the moment. But what we're seeing is a 25% impact on goods that are non-USMCA compliant. So when you hear the 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico, it's just for goods outside of the USMCA agreement. And as we're talking this through, maybe it would be good for us to link that on our exemption, so it's easy to reference for the group as well. Another thing is a lower 10% energy tariffs that also fall out of USMCA preference, right? So it's lower than the 25%. So you can see those exclusions there. The exception is going to be a lot of these where is it? There's the steel and aluminum in the autos. So a lot of where you hear frustration with Canada and Mexico is on those tariffs, and those are captured separately. So not in the global tariff, but you could see those in our dashboard as well. And I'm looking for them right here. This is section 232 right here. So this is one of the impacts on Canada. So on automobiles and automobile parts. And then on all steel and aluminum as well is something that is being tracked on our end under 232 as well.
Ben, while you're on Canada,
Yeah.
any insights from the trade mission, the governor's trade mission that happened this week there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have received updates and I've heard it went well, but maybe we can discuss some of those details actually in the next session, so we can, yeah, have some detailed updates for the group on what took place. So
Yeah, I like it. Yeah, I think that was a very timely, how that all worked out, very timely, and I suspect some interesting discussions, and I'm looking forward to hearing how that went.
yeah, and I
Um,
think it's also great. Like Utah is, a lot of states are backing off in a lot of these conversations, we'll say, and Utah is just leaning in anyway and just working through some of the challenges happening at the national level. And that's one thing that we've heard time and time again. And yeah, gives us
is it
some.
true that Governor Cox is the first governor from the U.S. to go there since the inauguration
That's what I've heard.
on an
I haven't
official visit? Yeah,
personally verified that, but I have heard that is the case. Yeah.
that's great. I'd be curious to hear, are there any, have you been hearing, I've heard a couple maybe nice ideas. Have you heard anything new in terms of what companies are doing to tactically or strategically to kind of combat and deal with the changing landscape right now?
Yeah, Troy, maybe we can have a back and forth about this because I haven't, gone into the specifics on this, but one of the things I've heard an uptick in conversation on specifically this week is looking at the rules of origin and where your product is coming from and what modifications you could do to consider where that certificate is how it's stated. So I don't know if you have any thoughts to share from what you've heard on that front or any technical guidance, but that's sort of from the policy and business side and some of the chatter that I've heard. I have heard an uptick in those conversations. So that may be something for us to bring back to the group. It's still fairly new to me on what exactly they're doing and how, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that earlier in the year, a lot of companies, and we talked to several of them, as you and I, as part of some World Trade Center roundtables, and folks were saying, okay, we're going to go back and look at our HTS codes or the rules of origin again, and our contracts. And then what I've heard recently is kind of a whole other wave of that. Like, yeah, we looked at it before, and for example, contracts, we looked at our agreements and said, shoot, we don't have a mechanism to change to address the price. Now companies are saying, we've decided to look at them even closer this time. And we're doing things like saying, okay, we've got a contract that covers goods, but it also covers some IP or services. Can we maybe reallocate where the value to those things is
Yes.
in a legal way? Is that doable? When they're analyzing that, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Uh, Maybe another idea is looking at the force majeure clauses in their contracts. Would those provide any support or help? Or even an interesting one I heard the other day was looking at the tax clause in a contract. Sometimes clauses will say who pays for taxes. No one really thought about tariffs as taxes, but maybe you should. So
Yeah.
these are things that are obviously going to probably put you in a bit of a fight with your contractual counterparty. But given given how the stakes just keep getting raised higher and higher, and maybe that's something to consider, at least think about.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Um, in terms of let me just check and see if any questions, folks, please send them in. Um, in terms of other little minor updates, so I saw yesterday, uh, uh, Secretary Bessent said, look, I know everyone's clamoring for certainty. Give us 90 days and you'll have certainty. And I mean, I wish we had certainty today, but that is something to look forward to if they can stick to that. I don't know if you have any views on that, Ben, in terms of where this is all going to shake out, where we're headed right now. Is it going to, in the end, just be kind of a fight between China and the US? Not just that, that's fairly significant, and markets don't like that. But any opinions, views, insights which you've heard, I think would be great to share with the group.
Well, if I were to just look at that comment based on what we're seeing, what we're tracking on tariffs, it seems to align with the global tariff implementation on the variable rates, and is saying give us some space to negotiate with these countries so that we can land on a number that we agree with, and then everybody will know what that looks like moving forward. So then companies can have a better sense of how much it will cost to import from Vietnam, right? Is it going to be the 46, 44, 46%, or is it going to be a lower rate, right? So in terms of China, from what we've seen, is getting special treatment. Let's say in terms of the global environment versus China, of course, with the global tariff coming down to the baseline 10%, and then China really things ratcheting up in retaliation on both sides. And so if I were to think about this in three buckets, I would think about it as in China, Mexico, Canada within USMCA, and then the rest of the world. And we have some
I like
level of
that.
certainty, I would say, with USMCA already. We haven't really seen a ton of moving parts since I'm looking at the date, since it would be since really March 7th. China, if they're not going to retaliate further, and that's what we're hearing from them, you can kind of assume some certainty with the high risk side of 186% if they don't continue to retaliate. And then if you look at it in terms of the rest of the world, that's probably the 90-day window of right now it's baseline 10%, but you have some variable rates that are going to be negotiated over the next 90 days. So looking at how that falls will be key.
I agree with that, even though it's hard to, no one wants to be very specific in the situation because I wouldn't say we've been burned, but things just continue to change and been so volatile on the policy front here. But it does feel like the course where they're the hard and fast discussions with these countries that supposedly come to the White House and are asking to do deals. That does appear to be happening very fast. The U.S.-China situation can't, I mean, it can, but it can't really go on forever. And you hear both sides saying, we're waiting. The White House is saying, we're waiting for, I just saw, an undersecretary this morning saying, we're waiting for China to call. We're ready to talk. And obviously China's said the same thing. We're ready to talk. We're waiting for the White House to call. So will that will the diplomats do I think they'll do their job and they'll finagle a discussion at some point. Does that make it better or worse? I guess we'll see. But um,
Yeah.
consumer sentiment. I just saw the headline before we started this call, kind of at a 10-year low at the moment. Luckily, sentiment can change again quickly. But I don't know. Any other thoughts, Ben, on what you would tell companies? Last week we said be patient, and I think that's still good advice. But what else? How are you feeling today, and what do you think we ought to say?
Well, I think, as we're talking this out, there is more certainty on the horizon, I would say. And I do think it is going to be still turbulent. And we're going to have a lot of updates in the coming weeks as we go through the dashboard and discover what retaliations are going to be or not. But I would say I've heard a lot of people, because of some of the certainties, especially if you have exclusions under USMCA, taking a look at Mexico. Just, if you're in China, does Mexico make sense? Companies intuitively know pretty quickly if that is the case. We're not saying shift your operations, because who knows how this is going to play out with you know, China and those negotiations. But I've heard more of an uptick in people looking at Mexico. That may be something to consider. Another thing is, yeah, starting to have conversations about rules of origin and where your product is documented to have come from and what the rules are, and of course meeting the rules. But dusting that off is, it seems like a key piece here. And then you know, engage with us if we can explore other things. The foreign trade zone isn't a fit for everybody, but one good example or case where it could be is if you're a company who's importing a lot of goods, getting hit with this tariff, but then you're exporting them afterwards, you shouldn't be paying the tariff. And the foreign trade zone can be especially helpful in that case in particular. But there are other cases as well, but that, you know, it's not a silver bullet for these tariffs, but especially in the case where you're turning around and exporting after either making a modification to the product or just turning around and exporting right afterwards, it's useful to have a tool like that and not have to pay some of these taxes on the tariffs. That would be
Yeah,
my
yeah.
parting thoughts, I think.
No, that's good. And on that FTZ, even if you're a company that brings in a lot of raw materials or components, and your inventory, that you know, your those raw materials and components sit there for a while, even if it's just a few weeks or a couple of months, the working capital savings you'll have by delaying the timing of paying those tariffs by using an FTZ, I think can be pretty meaningful, especially over time. So I think that's good. I don't, we don't have any more questions. I would just say again, kind of where we started, um, staying close to the information, and then and I'm a huge believer in process. And frankly, if any of you, like within your companies, are like, what do you mean by process? How do we do that? Reach out to Ben, reach out to any of us, and form a group in your company, have regular discussions. That's where you get to see what other people are seeing, and it helps inform decisions. And we're happy to kind of help with, you know, help you think through what that internal process would look like, so that you make sure all the information is coming to decision makers. You're able to make decisions real time, but also make smart strategic decisions that'll give you the best optionality and flexibility going forward. So with that, I think we will thank everyone for coming and for joining, and we'll do the same thing next week, same time, same place. And we look forward to seeing you then.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Troy.
All right. Thanks.